You know what? If I'm going to be covering MTG more often, if I'm going to start covering the spoiler season for Aether Drift and everything, I think it's pretty relevant that I talk about the Banlist updates too as they come out, and considering how big, in theory, this one was, granted not as big as the Commander Banlist that kicked all this off on my channel, I think it's a good place to start here. So admittedly, almost all the bans are in the modern format, so full disclosure from me, it's been quite a while since I was at the height of my active interest in the modern format. I pay attention, but some of the more in-depth intricacies may be above me, so by all means, if you feel like you know something that I don't, let me know in the comments. Admittedly, the organization of this video is going to be a little bit less clear than the previous one, mostly because I'm going to be talking about unbannings too. In fact, let's start with those. 3 in particular I want to address first before going over what they state as the philosophy behind all of them. Let me just state all of the unbannings first. Green Sun Zenith, Faithless Looting, Mox Opal, and Splinter Twin all being unbanned in Modern. And truthfully, the reasoning seems pretty simple for at the very least, most of them. Let's start with Faceless Looting because it's actually the most disconnected in reasoning from the others. I think my best way to talk about this is to start with how I tend to read these ban list announcements. See, for me, I like to think about what the reasoning for a ban is before I scroll down to the reasoning given by Wizards, which allows me to more effectively parse if I feel the decision is warranted or not. And to be honest, I kind of always questioned this card being banned in the first place, as it really feels like it was done as an overcorrection to the Hogak deck in 2019. And when I scroll down to their reasoning, while they say it was used in other decks, they basically admit that it was only ban-worthy in Hogak. I mean, honestly, that's like banning Emrakul when Aetherworks Marvel is the actual problem, which they did in 2017 in Standard, but I'm getting off topic. So yeah, Faithless Looting is probably the most obvious unbanning. Probably shouldn't have been done in the first place. Quite possibly, in the past few years, it's the most obvious as a matter of fact, but I guess that depends on if the eventual Commander unbannings that are coming include Panoptic Mirror or not. Hot takes all around. But I think the philosophy behind Mox Opal and Green Sun Zenith are pretty well linked. Basically, it's power creep. The type of stuff people were doing with Green Sun Zenith just aren't as good anymore, mostly because a lot of the best creatures in Modern aren't green, and in some cases, I'd argue, are too expensive for using Zenith to get them out to be a good play. Like, the article itself mentions Primeval Titan, but I'm sorry, I don't think spending the mana to get out a Prime Time with Green Sun Zenith is really that good, even in Tron. Now, truthfully, unbanning Zenith, as they note, has the potential for making green creature decks better. In fact, it could even revive Tarmogoyf as a viable card in the format. Getting 2 or 3 card types in Graves by the start of turn 3 seems very feasible, and could especially boost the Goyf if Zenith itself is adding to that Delirium count. Artifact decks have also been powered out of the format, and Mox Opal giving a ton of extra mana to aggro out does actually help get them back in the thick of the conversation, but it still translates to a power creep situation. Strategies like Affinity and Lantern Control just don't do enough fast enough anymore, and Mox Opal would really just bring stuff like that in line with more dominant strategies rather than putting it ahead of them. But the summation for both of them is the same. It's power creep. The decks that got these cards banned have been power crept out of the top tier. So given the overall philosophy of the unbannings, I think pointing out the power creep of these really just proves that philosophy to be valid. But then we get to talk about Splinter Twin, and that's where I talk about the philosophical underpinnings stated in the article as a whole. The whole thesis behind these unbannings in particular is an attempt to address the perception that power creep has made Modern too much of a rotating format. It's something I don't fully agree with because I played Yu-Gi-Oh!, so I know that non-rotating formats either do this or remain stagnant to the point of boredom from a competitive standpoint, but I get why other people do feel that way. And no unbanning exemplifies their attempt to address giving more nostalgia to the Modern format than Splinter Twin, the centerpiece of one of Modern's most iconic decks, and the strategy that defined one of the original core tenets of the competitive philosophy of how Modern functions. See, back during the format where Splinter Twin was legal, there was a clear rule being presented in a lot of the ban list and among the competitive scene that Modern is a turn 4 format. What that means is that decks will typically start being able to win the game if they remain unchecked around their 4th turn, which is the type of win condition that Splinter Twin creates. If you're able to have your combo pieces that go infinite with it already on the board, and then play it to get your combo and win. For those who don't know the combo, it's basically that you play Splinter Twin onto a creature that can untap a creature when it enters, and copy it to untap the original and just keep doing that infinitely. I don't even think it's power creep that's the result of this either, at least not in terms of decks being able to win faster or anything like that, but rather that power creep comes in terms of answers being able to come at lower cost than they did before, which is also part of the justification they give elsewhere. Artifact hate and graveyard hate are, according to them at least, more prevalent than they ever were before. I mean, I'd argue against that, actually. Artifact hate like Stony Silence was super easy to sideboard into, and that's just the most common answer to the affinity-style artifact decks like Mox Opal breaks the most, let alone the artifact spot removal cards, and Modern, even during Hogak, had Tormod's Crypt, Scavenging Ooze with Jukabog. Those are just off the top of my head about the kind of graveyard hate that was around then, most of which just plain wasn't being run at all for some reason, in spite of how easily they shut down Hogak. But in terms of non-green creatures being better at having cheaper Splinter Twin combo answers, yeah, I would agree with power creep being a prevalent reason there. See, if they're worried about power creep being too much, the best way to address that is with what they ban, which is what I'm about to get into next. Before I go too far on that, I just real quick want to touch on the legacy list, which I know less about than even Modern, admittedly, so I could be a little off base here, but based on the surface level, these do make sense. Psychic Frog in particular is one I think I could be wrong about. It just seemed to me like a card that takes advantage of creating cycles of card movement in terms of legacy, but apparently it's specifically Dimir Reanimator that's the problem, according to the article in particular. I'm not sure how heavily favored that is in the metagame of Legacy to say that it needs to be hit again after Grief got hit, so sure. Vexing Bauble, I didn't even need to read their reasonings to understand fully. Free spells are an integral part of Legacy's checks and balances, so shutting them off is going to be incredibly bad for that metagame. In fact, when I read this card, I predicted that it was probably going to get banned at Legacy at some point, and I wouldn't be surprised if it gets banned in Modern in the future if they continue printing free spells for the Modern format. Speaking of the Modern format, let's get back to that. Well, somewhat, because I'm really talking about Pioneer when I talk about this next card. Gigantha got banned in Pioneer and Modern. And Explorer, sure, that counts too, I guess. I didn't really know Pioneer enough to get why, but apparently it comes down to it being universally utilized. So, the same problem with every companion that's gotten some kind of banhammer. Whether it's Luris in damn near every format under the sun, or Lutri in Commander for its dex restriction being non-existent. Hell, the entire companion mechanic even had to be errated. The text on those cards isn't what they actually do anymore. It's almost like, while the gimmick of Companion was a pretty cool idea, some of the restrictions really serve to be mostly meaningless and create an elevation of power level for basically no sacrifice. But I feel like the discussion of what went wrong with the companion mechanic is one for another time. What it's time for now is to actually focus on Modern. Okay, show of hands, who here is surprised that the One Ring got banned? Yeah, put Teferi's Protection on an artifact that draws you cards, and wow, go figure, it's busted. I don't even think this card was a design mistake either, at least not entirely. See, in a vacuum, it's about on par with Teferi's Protection. It costs more, doesn't protect your board, and although the damage you take for the card draw doesn't exactly equate very well when you know how to use it to balance out when you're at the point you're trying to survive to close a game out next turn, the sorcery speed on it being an artifact certainly makes it a much weaker defensive play. But, you notice how the card I'm comparing it to Teferi's Protection, isn't in Modern? Yeah, I think the fact the card I keep comparing it to was one that has never even been considered for a modern legal printing is telling for how deserved this banning really is. I think a lot of people would say that this was something that was needed for a long time, since it's basically every deck to a certain point, but the deck that really pushed it over the tops in terms of the ban list was Boros Energy, which is where the last banned card really comes into play. Now, the One Ring doesn't define Boros Energy at all, but there's a lot of aspects of that deck that serve to shore up the weaknesses of a card like the One Ring. Being able to come down incredibly early, for example, is one of those big aspects, which is where I get into the actual banned card that is banned because of the Boros Energy deck, Amped Raptor. Look, at the end of the day, the Boros Energy deck that came about from Modern Horizons 3 is an evolution of the consistently tier 2 or 3 Soul Sister strategy that Modern's had for quite a long time. And Amped Raptor kind of pushes that into too much. Now, the idea behind Soul Sisters is that you gain life for creatures entering, and that life gain triggers other things, and while traditionally a mono-white strategy, there are certainly ways to sneak red into those lists already with things like Lightning Helix, which now gets to take a form of a 3-mana creature that you play out of your grave for 4 mana, actually. The newest of the Soul Sisters, Guide of Souls, is the crux of what makes Boros Energy less about life gain and more about old mechanics from sets named after renamed planes. More on that during Aether Drift spoiler season. And Amped Raptor certainly does a lot for that by letting you get potentially 2 bodies, but begins to delve past the turn 4 format rule I was talking about earlier, which is part of its dominance, where you start being in a winning position on turn 3 instead of turn 4, if not sooner in a few cases. And Boros Energy, by the way, is one of the decks I kind of like, in a sense. I've always enjoyed the Soul Sisters concept, and seeing an archetype I enjoy merged with another deck archetype I enjoy with energy is super cool for me, but I'm willing to acknowledge when things are too much, and Amped Raptor is the key to it being too much. I think you can still do Soul Sisters with an energy package thanks to Guide of Souls, but Amped Raptor pushed that concept beyond the point of being balanced that basically could have been fixed by making it a more expensive play mana-wise. Overall, I do like the ban list. I think a lot of people who are worried about Modern Horizons power creep are going to like this ban list if maybe they think that it doesn't go far enough. But when you're rebalancing a non-rotating format like this, I think it tends to be preferable for most of the bannings and unbannings to be less based on cards straight up being too strong, but rather creating a change in the format based on one deck being a little too strong right now and another deck being a little too weak right now. But in this case, when I look at the numbers on MTG Goldfish, I can see that Boros Energy has a lot, so it makes sense to primarily hit Boros Energy. The pattern of unbannings was stated in the article to be getting revisited in March. So, I guess we'll be revisiting Modern then to take a closer look ourselves at what the experiment with power creep of some of the previously most powerful decks in the format shows about power creep in Magic the Gathering, which I may actually give an initial look at shortly before the ban list in this particular time frame. But until then, I suppose I'll see you guys for when I actually start talking about the Aether Drift spoilers instead of talking about something other than race cars. We're gonna be talking about race cars in Magic the Gathering. I wonder if the set's gonna have vehicles. It's mystery. Probably yes. Anyway, until next time, this is your friendly neighborhood Boonslayer signing out.